than just the locations where Yolanda Johnson and Angela Polidori were found. They also have the address where Maria Apodaca was buried, the same place Solomon was living in when she disappeared in October 1986. To prove that Solomon is responsible for all three murders, detectives follow leads that take them to almost every corner of the Sacramento suburb.
They came up with something like nearly 20 residents that this person was connected with, and most of these houses was in the Oak Park area.
We started looking into all of the different places that he had lived, all the different places that he had worked. Information that we were receiving that some of these people missing were last seen with Morris Solomon. We started to connect the dots.
On April 20th, 1987, those dots lead police to an address where Solomon resided from January until late March 1986.
This house was known to be a crack house. Place where people went to do drugs. There were people in and out of this house, always. Drug dealers, drug users, prostitutes.
Detectives are there to check out a derelict car left behind by Solomon when he moved out. In the backyard, they notice an unusual depression in the ground next to the house. They borrow a shovel from a neighbor and begin to dig.
They went in the backyard. They took a couple shovelfuls of dirt from this shallow grave, and a face emerged. A skeletized face emerged from the ground. Whoa, so they bounced back. Oh, we have another dead body here. So they called in an excavation team. They come and they dig the body out.
The condition of the body wasn't ideal, and the dirt had to be removed very, very carefully, especially around the face and mouth, because we were very certain that this was going to require a dental identification. And what we didn't want to do was damage the body any further with shovels or trowels or anything like that.
As the body is uncovered, investigators can see that it is female and that there are similarities to the three previous victims.
She was bound from her wrist, this time in the front, and from her legs, half nude from the waist down.
The cause of death still was not, openly clear, but we still could tell it was a foul play type of death.
By the following day, the coroner's office is able to identify the victim as 26-year-old Cherie Washington, missing since February. Once again, police keep the suspect's identity under wraps. After a month of surveillance, Solomon has done nothing to connect himself to the crimes. And although he is aware of the discovery of more bodies, he has made no attempt to leave town. Meanwhile, the investigation brings homicide detectives to another Oak Park address where Morris Solomon was living when the body of Yolanda Johnson was discovered. In the backyard, they find the shallow graves of two more victims, wrapped in bedding and tied in bundles. Both bodies are so decomposed that it is clear they were buried months before Yolanda Johnson was killed in June 1986. One of them is on John Cabrera's missing persons list, 24-year-old prostitute Linda Vitella, who has been missing for more than a year. With the discovery of more bodies at the addresses directly tied to their suspect, the district attorney's office is now ready to issue a warrant. Later that evening, at 8:05 p.m., police arrive at another Oak Park address, not to search for a body, but to arrest the man who lives there. Morris Solomon Jr. gives up without a struggle, maintaining the same quiet demeanor he presented to police when he first reported the discovery of Yolanda Johnson's body almost a year earlier.
I think what Morris was trying to do was the double psychology, and that is, why would I report a body in a house that I was working on if I was the one who had killed her? That proved to be his fatal move. From a homicide detective's point of view, if you look at the evidence, the first person that we look at is that person that made the phone call. And that was Morris Solomon.
Although there are no witnesses and no physical evidence to connect Solomon to any of the crimes, He is charged with 6 counts of murder.
And I believe there was enough circumstantial evidence piling up against him where they could issue a warrant for him. But they never found anything on him, in his possession, anything like that.
I think people were probably shocked that one person was doing all this. To me, it just didn't seem like a serial deal. You know, until we found out from the police that that's what was suspected. You know, I said, is he the guy that supposedly, you know, killed all the women? And they said, yeah, that's him. And boy, what a mousy-looking little dude. You know, that just looked like, you know, he wouldn't be capable of something like that.
There was just nothing that would, in my opinion, keep prostitutes away from him. I think they looked at him in the same way as, here's a guy who's harmless, you know, who's got money. Let's go smoke some rock, and we'll have some sex too, and I'm going to make money because this guy's capable of doing anything. Just take a look at him. And, of course, he used it to his advantage. You know, it would be like, you know, come with me, said the spider to the fly.
Morris Solomon denies having anything to do with the killings.
Might take me 2-3 years of sitting in your county jail, but I know in my heart and my mind I haven't killed nobody. I mean, I'm not no angel. I did a lot of wrong things in my life, but to kill a person, no.
There are those who can verify this dark underside of Solomon's personality, women who narrowly escaped his web. Several of them contact authorities after his arrest. One important piece of the puzzle finally falls into place after the arrest. The semen sample taken from Yolanda Johnson's thigh turns out to be consistent with a sample of Solomon's blood.
DNA technology then was new as far as the courts were concerned, but it was narrowed down fairly closely that it was Morris Solomon that was the person that had sex with her shortly before she died.
Despite the media attention, the Solomon case raises only a few eyebrows outside the Oak Park suburb, even after a 7th body is found a week after the handyman's arrest.
I think that the residents just believe that these were people that were in a business that was volatile as far as death or injury or being victimized, and looked at it in some sense that way. That was Oak Park.
Morris Solomon Jr. faces 7 counts of murder in the first degree. The trial that follows will tell the tale of a double-edged personality, harmless and unassuming on the outside, but diabolical and deadly within. May 1991. In a courtroom in Sacramento, California, the trial of Morris Solomon Jr. gets underway. The handyman is charged with the first-degree murders of 7 women in the suburb of Oak Park during 1986 and 1987. At first glance, the defendant seems incapable of such horrendous crimes. Even the police admit that during their investigation, Solomon was always cooperative and eager to help.
But, you know, this type of behavior is not uncommon or unusual when you're talking about a serial killer. Very likable, very manipulative, very sociable. All those skills which got him through the front door, but the violence and the horrendous acts that he committed on the victims, it was just unbelievable. This guy was just a killing machine.
Although the murders have been covered extensively, only a dozen spectators show up for the opening statements. The defense presents Solomon as a victim himself, painting a picture of a life shaped by violence at an early age.
Morris was born in Albany, Georgia, in 1944, Deep South state. He was basically raised by his grandmother, and his grandmother beat the hell out of him and his brother and his cousin.
She would tie him up with electrical cords, tie him to his bed. And this went on for years and years and years. And I think it's more than a coincidence that many of the ladies, when they were found, had electrical cords wrapped around them.
A tour of duty in Vietnam in the mid-60s affords Solomon his first experience with prostitution, a way to relieve the stress of combat.
To have sex with the Asian women in Vietnam. But there was another side to that. The GIs were having sex sometimes with the enemy and did not know it.
Many times, prostitutes were used by the enemy to inflict pain and suffering on the soldiers. So GIs knew that they could also be dangerous, and Morris picked up on that.
Matter of fact, one of Morris Solomon's friends was killed by a prostitute right there in front of him. So I think in the process it was have sex with him, but bound, gag, and rape him. I think that carried on back in the United States when he came back in 1966.
I know a lot of the fellows who came back, there were many, and their personalities were really changed.
The prosecution introduces 15,000 court documents and over 600 exhibits that depict Solomon as a cold-blooded killer, whose friendly, unassuming manner, along with the promise of drugs and money, endeared him to local prostitutes needing to score.
He seemed to prey on vulnerable people, people that did have a history of being on the outskirts of society, drug addicts, prostitutes. I think it was availability. He lived in the neighborhood. He knew a lot of these people. I think they were available to him, basically, and trusted him.
The evidence, however, is all circumstantial, since no one actually saw Solomon kill any of the victims.
There was no hard evidence to really connect him to. The pathologists, the coroners, they could not determine a cause of death.
At the same time, there are witnesses who can testify that they saw the victims in Solomon's company.
Well, I think the main common thread that the prosecutor had was the fact that Morris Solomon had had contact with all of these ladies, and that Morris Solomon generally had some connection to the location where each and every one of them were found.
In addition to this, surviving victims of Solomon's attacks testify against him. A former prostitute tells the court that Solomon tied her up with electrical cords in August 1986 and raped her repeatedly until her boyfriend's return scared him off. Since she was on probation, she had not reported the attack at the time. Another woman tells a story of being attacked by a man who tries to drag her into his truck at knife point. She escaped, but did not report the incident immediately. In court, she identifies the man as Morris Solomon Jr. On August 29th, 1991, after 10 days of deliberation, the jury returns with its verdict. Guilty on 6 of the 7 counts of murder.
4 of them were first-degree murders, 2 of them were second-degree murders. And plus he was convicted of 5 other sexual offenses from women who survived his attacks.
The sentence is death by lethal injection. And on September 23rd, 1992, Morris Solomon Jr. is transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he awaits execution as the 342nd inmate to be sent to death row.
I just don't think there was anything left for the jury to do, given the fact that he was convicted of 6 murders. To say that Morris would have killed a certain amount of people and stopped would be wrong. Morris would have continued to kill and kill and kill until he was stopped.
To this day, Morris Solomon Jr. denies being involved in any of the killings. He remains on death row and as yet does not have an execution date.
He knows he's not going anywhere. That's his life. And quite honestly, I do not believe that they're going to get a chance to inject that needle in his arm. I think he'll die in there of natural causes. I believe he thinks he'll die in there of natural causes.
Solomon leaves behind families devastated by the loss of their loved ones, not only the 7 known victims, but also those whose fates will forever remain a mystery.
Morris Solomon, to me, has to be one of the top serial killers, simply because, you know, we